Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on something that you might not have heard much about,
Hmm.
but it's a really big deal in British classrooms these days.
Okay.
It's this idea of psychological safety, and we'll be looking at this article from inclusiveteach.com called Building Psychological Safety: Essential Strategies for Schools.
Gotcha.
And we're going to try to break it down, like, what is this?
Hmm.
Why is it so important? And, like, how do you actually make it happen in a school?
Yeah.
But here's something interesting to think about. You know how, like, a teacher responds to a kid getting the wrong answer can, like, totally change
Right.
how that kid learns from that point on.
Hmm.
That's just one example of why this is so important.
Yeah, psychological safety is fascinating because it's not just like some fluffy feel-good concept.
Right.
It's like backed up by serious research, like going way back to Amy Edmondson's work at Harvard.
So, okay, let's get to the heart of it. What does psychological safety actually look like in a British classroom?
Well, picture this,
Yeah.
right? A classroom where like every single student feels totally comfortable speaking up,
Okay.
taking risks, making mistakes even.
Yeah.
And they don't have to be afraid of being judged for it.
That sounds incredible, but, like, how does that actually work in a real classroom? I mean, is there, like, evidence that this stuff actually makes a difference?
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
There's a 2020 study by Wang and some other researchers, and they found that in classrooms with high psychological safety, students were way more likely to participate in discussions.
Yeah.
You'd ask questions. They even challenged the teacher's ideas respectfully.
Oh, wow.
And get this, these students actually performed better academically,
Wow, that's amazing.
and they showed fewer signs of stress and anxiety too.
Okay, so that's really powerful. But the article we're looking at today, it seems like it paints a kind of different picture of British classrooms, doesn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately it does.
Yeah.
Despite teachers' best intentions.
Yeah.
The article suggests that a lot of British classrooms don't always quite nail it when it comes to psychological safety. It seems like the focus on exams and performance sometimes overshadows like the joy of actually learning and exploring.
Yeah, it's like the system is accidentally telling kids that making mistakes is a bad thing instead of, like, a chance to learn and grow.
Right.
No wonder so many people end up being scared of subjects like math.
Right.
It's probably because they were made to feel like it wasn't okay to mess up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Back in primary school.
That fear of math, it's a perfect example of what happens when psychological safety is missing.
Mm.
And it actually feeds into this idea of a fixed mindset,
Uh-huh.
which Carol Dweck came up with. It's basically this belief that your abilities are set in stone,
Mm.
like you're either good at something or you're not.
So if a student thinks they're bad at math, they're not even going to try to get better.
Yeah,
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
exactly. And that's where the real cost of ignoring psychological safety becomes crystal clear.
Yeah.
It's not just about making students feel warm and fuzzy. It's about actually creating an environment where they can learn and develop the skills they need to really thrive.
Okay, I'm with you. We got to fix this.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin? The article talks about this framework for psychological safety. What are the basic parts of that?
One of the most important things is something called leadership modeling, vulnerability.
Uh-huh.
School leaders and teachers need to actually show students that it's okay to not have all the answers,
Right.
to make mistakes, to constantly be learning.
So it's like saying, hey, I make mistakes too,
Yeah,
and it's okay. That's just part of learning.
exactly. And it doesn't necessarily mean that teachers have to like spill all their personal struggles,
Okay.
but being open about their own learning process,
Mhm.
Like a teacher could talk about how they struggle to learn a particular concept
Right.
or how they're still trying to improve in certain areas.
Yeah.
It just helps create this culture where learning is seen as a journey,
Mm-hmm.
not a destination.
That makes a lot of sense. So what other important ideas does the article highlight?
Another key thing is rethinking how we give feedback.
Okay.
Instead of just saying this is right or this is wrong,
Right. Right.
we need to actually engage students in conversations about their process.
So instead of just saying this is wrong, a teacher might ask, like, well, what were you thinking here?
Exactly.
Or, like, what strategies did you use?
Exactly. This kind of feedback helps students understand how they learn,
Yeah.
and it encourages them to take ownership of their mistakes. It
Mhm.
shifts the focus from like judgment to understanding and growth.
I like that. Now, the article also mentions this thing called dialogic teaching.
Yeah,
Can you explain what that means?
sure. It sounds fancy, but it's basically about going beyond those simple question and answer type of things
Okay.
and actually creating real discussions where students feel comfortable sharing their ideas,
Yeah.
even if their ideas aren't fully formed yet.
That sounds great in theory, But won't things just get chaotic or go off on
There's
tangents?
always that risk.
Right.
But, a skilled teacher can keep those discussions on track and productive. The key is having a clear structure and ground rules for respectful communication.
So it's like finding a balance between giving students freedom and having some structure.
Exactly. It's a balancing act for sure. But the payoff is huge.
Mm.
When students feel safe to participate in these kinds of discussions, they learn how to think critically,
Yeah.
how to express themselves clearly, and they build confidence in their own voices.
I can already see how powerful these principles could be in transforming a classroom. But I'm curious, does the article get into any specific strategies
Yeah.
for putting these ideas into practice?
It does. We're going to delve into those right after a quick break. Stay with us.
All right, sounds good. So we're back and ready to dig into some of these, the specific strategies for building psychological safety in British classrooms. So where do we start?
Well, the article talks about assessment, which you might think is the opposite of psychological safety.
Yeah, I remember those like heart-stopping moments before a big exam. Not exactly a recipe for feeling safe and confident.
Exactly. But the article is saying that we can actually use assessment as a tool to build psychological safety.
Right.
It's about shifting away from like those big high-stakes tests and moving towards more like formative and process-oriented approaches.
Okay, that's interesting. So what does that actually look like?
Well, one example is learning portfolios.
Hmm.
So instead of just looking at a final grade, students are like collecting evidence of their learning over time.
Hmm.
This could be like drafts of their work, reflections on what they've learned, and even examples of mistakes that they've learned from.
So it's not just about the final product, it's more about showing the whole process of learning.
Exactly. It helps students see how much they've grown and learn to embrace those little stumbles along the way without being afraid of getting a bad grade. Plus, it gives teachers a much better understanding of how each student learns best.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like saying, hey, we're all a work in progress.
Right.
And that's okay. But what about those big standardized tests? You know, the ones that are kind of unavoidable in the British education system.
That's a great question. And the article does acknowledge that reality. It's not about getting rid of exams completely, but it's about thinking of them as learning opportunities rather than just a way to measure how smart you are.
Okay, so how do you make those big tests feel less, well, high stakes?
It starts with transparency. Teachers can explain why the exam is important, what skills it's testing, and how students can prepare well for it.
So it's all about helping students understand what's going on and giving them the tools to feel more in control.
Exactly. And it's about giving them chances to practice in low-pressure situations and
Yeah.
getting feedback so they can build their confidence and figure out what they need help with.
That makes sense. But there's something else we need to consider, right? The article also mentions how important cultural differences are when we're talking about psychological safety.
Absolutely. You're right. What feels safe for one student might feel totally different for another student, depending on where they come from and their cultural background.
So like a classroom that feels really welcoming and inclusive to one student might actually feel intimidating or even disrespectful to another student.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that's where cultural competence becomes so crucial. Teachers need to be aware of those differences and create learning environments that are flexible enough to meet everyone's needs.
Wow, that sounds really challenging. How can teachers actually develop that kind of cultural competence?
Well, it starts with looking inward. Teachers need to examine their own biases and assumptions and be willing to learn from their students. They also need to create opportunities for students to share their cultures and perspectives and learn from each other.
So it's about recognizing that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching,
Right.
and that each student brings their own unique strengths and challenges to the classroom.
Precisely.
Mm.
And when teachers create this kind of culturally responsive environment, everyone benefits. Students feel seen and valued for who they are, and they're more likely to get involved in learning and take those risks.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation so far. But before we move on, I want to touch on something that really stood out to me in this article. It's this idea that psychological safety isn't just good for students, it's good for teachers too.
You're absolutely right. The research shows that teachers who work in psychologically safe environments are happier, more engaged, and they're less likely to burn out.
So it's like a positive feedback loop. When teachers feel supported, they're better at creating that same kind of environment for their students.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that teachers are human too, and they need to feel psychologically safe to do their best work.
This all makes so much sense. But how do we know if we're actually doing a good job at creating these psychologically safe classrooms? Can we measure it somehow?
That's where it gets a bit tricky. Psychological safety isn't like test scores or attendance.
Mhm.
You can't really measure it with numbers.
So, how can we tell if we're on the right track? What should we be looking for?
Well, we can't exactly like measure psychological safety with a ruler or anything,
Right.
but there are definitely some signs we can watch out for.
Mhm.
Like in a classroom where psychological safety is strong, you'd see students participating a lot,
Right.
asking questions and even like respectfully challenging each other's ideas.
So it's more about observing the whole classroom vibe than checking off boxes on some list.
Exactly. Pay attention to how students interact, with each other, with the material and with the teacher.
Yeah.
Do they seem interested? Are they willing to take risks? Do they feel okay admitting when they don't understand something?
Hmm.
Those are all clues about the level of psychological safety in the room.
This is making me realize that this whole concept is a lot more complex than I initially thought.
Hmm.
It's not just about being nice or creating a cozy atmosphere. It's about building a culture of respect and trust
Right.
and open communication where everyone feels like they can learn and grow without being judged.
You nailed it. And here's the thing. Creating this kind of culture isn't just the job of teachers and principals.
Mm.
It's something we can all work on in all parts of our lives.
So even if we're not teachers or involved in education directly, we can still help promote psychological safety in our workplaces, our families, our communities.
Exactly. Think about it.
Right.
Have you ever been in a meeting where people were afraid to speak up because they might get shut down? Or maybe you've been to a family gathering where certain topics were just off limits,
Right.
creating
Yeah.
this kind of awkward tension. Those are all situations where psychological safety is missing.
It seems like creating a psychologically safe environment is something we always have to be working on.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And the article we've been talking about, it doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide,
Yeah.
which is kind of the point.
Mm.
It leaves us with a really important question that we should all think about.
What's that?
What little things can we do to create more psychological safety in our own lives and the places where we have influence?
I love that. It means we don't have to wait for someone else to fix things. We can start making a difference right now in
Mhm.
our own little corner of the world. So what would that look like, practically speaking?
Well, for me, I try to be more aware of how I'm listening. Am I actually hearing what other people are saying,
Mhm.
or am I just waiting for my chance to talk? Am I approaching conversations with curiosity and wanting to understand, or am I quick to judge or give advice when nobody asked for it? Those are things I'm working on.
That's a really good point. For me, I think it's about getting more comfortable with silence.
Yeah,
We often feel like we need to fill every quiet moment, but those pauses can give people space to share their thoughts and feelings.
I agree. And it's also about celebrating effort and progress, not just the final result.
Mm.
It's about saying things like, I see how hard you're working, or I'm so proud of how far you've come, instead of only focusing on the outcome.
Those are all great ideas, and as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling so inspired. Psychological safety, it's not just a bonus, it's absolutely essential for creating learning environments where everyone can thrive.
Absolutely. And it's not limited to classrooms either. It's about all the places where we spend time, the relationships we build, and the culture we create together. So I want to encourage everyone listening to think about this. What small steps can you take today to make the spaces you're in a little bit safer, a little more welcoming, a little more open to learning and growth? It might seem like a small thing, but those little acts of kindness and intentionality can make a huge difference and create positive change that spreads far beyond ourselves.
I love that. And on that note, we'll say goodbye for today. Keep those minds curious, those hearts open, and keep exploring the world of knowledge. Until next time.